All right, welcome everyone. This is the Fort Collins Book Festival 5 year celebration. So today we're going to be talking about Live Long and Evolve, what Star Trek can teach us with Mohamed Noor. I am Erin Macdonald, so I am a good friend of Mohamed Noor, which we will be getting into in a little bit. My background is in astrophysics, and I've worked as a researcher, a aerospace engineer, and currently I'm working as a science consultant for the Star Trek franchise. Today, we're celebrating the first 5 years of the Fort Collins Book Festival, a virtual celebration of books and brews, writings and riffs, food and thought, big science, and the great outdoors. As always, we are also celebrating the importance of literature, writing, books, and our libraries. Check out the virtual program at www.focobookfest.org. We have book talks, discussions, panels, prose, and poetry readings over these 2 weekends, all for free. So make sure you attend as many as you can, and please share with your family and friends. Before we get to our session, I'd like to thank our sponsors. This festival could not happen without our generous sponsors. Today's event is produced by the Poudre River Public Library District in partnership with the CSU Morgan Library. Our presenting sponsor is the City of Fort Collins Fort Fund. Further support has been provided by the Friends of the Poudre Library District, Friends of Morgan Library, Lila B. Morgan Endowment Fund, Downtown Development Authority, Liggett Johnson and Goodman PC, Front Range Community College, Downtown Fort Collins Creative District, Old Firehouse Books, and our media partners, KUNC and 105.5 at the Colorado Sound. We'd like to give a special thanks to the Northern Colorado writers for presenting all 4 of our writers' workshops. So thank you, everyone. And thank you for supporting our 5th annual FOCO Book Festival in this great new format that we're all getting used to today. So as I mentioned at the top, today, we're going to be talking about Live Long and Evolve with Dr. Mohamed Noor, who's a professor of biology and the dean of natural sciences at Duke University. He teaches and leads a team conducting research in the broad areas of genetics and evolution. Professor Noor has held many elected scientific study offices, including president of the Society for the Study of Evolution and research journal editorships, such as editor-in-chief for Evolution from 2016 to 2019. He's also been active in education and outreach and teaches a popular online course on Coursera in genetics and evolution. Professor Noor published a book via Princeton University Press that uses Star Trek to teach principles in genetics and evolution, which is what we'll be discussing today, Live Long and Evolve. He regularly gives classes and talks at various venues using science fiction to teach scientific principles, and has recently been recruited as an occasional scientific consultant for the Star Trek universe. So welcome, Professor Noor.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here. Very honored to be here. Big thanks to the organizers for having me, and big thanks to Dr. Macdonald for being my host. As I was telling somebody earlier, I feel a little bit like a minor league player being interviewed by a major league player in terms of science outreach.
Oh, it's all good. I'm really happy to have you. And I mean, diving right in, you and I met at Dragon Con initially.
Yep. First time I went to 2014.
Which is amazing. I can't believe how long it's been. And for those people who might not be aware, Dragon Con is a popular culture convention which has tracks such as, fantasy literature, Star Trek, obviously, and even right, and topics like science and astronomy. So, since your primary job is teaching at a university, yes, what was your evolution? Making that transition from attending Dragon Con, seeing what it is there, and then figuring out how to incorporate that stuff and actually start teaching at these conventions themselves?
That's a great question. So actually, I credit to you because you were a big part of that, Dr. Macdonald. Thank you. The very first time I went to any convention actually was Dragon Con. And when I went there, I saw Dr. Macdonald and a colleague of mine, Dr. Eric Spana, give this talk on science in Mass Effect. And I didn't know, I'd heard of comic conventions and things like that before, and I thought it was just actor panels, which of course they have that too. But seeing that, it was really inspiring. Like, wow, I could do that. So I reached out to the person who runs the Trek track at Dragon Con, who is Garrett Wong. He's an actor in Star Trek Voyager and a great guy too. And I asked him, I said, would it be a possibility for me to make a talk on, for example, evidence for evolution, but using examples from Star Trek? And he said, sure, we're always looking for more content. And that was definitely what got the ball starting to roll down the hill, and it accelerated from there, more and more talks, and eventually leading to the book and everything from there.
Yeah. So what did you find how it's like teaching in front of a classroom versus teaching at a convention?
That's a wonderful question. So there's I mean, there's a lot of similarities in the sense that you have a set of content that you're presenting. I mean, there's a distinction between, say, for example, when I go to a comic convention versus when an actor goes. When an actor goes, like, they can just get up there and sit down, and people ask them questions like, "What do you have for breakfast?" And they're, and absolutely like drawn into that. For somebody like me, like they don't care what I had for breakfast. They want content, so I have to prepare like a lecture with a lot of scientific content, and basically be teaching a lesson. So that aspect, in a fundamental way, it's similar. There are multiple differences. First of all, like there's much broader diversity when you're speaking at a convention, and there are some people who know as much or more than undergraduates. There may be professional scientists sitting down who know this stuff really, really, really well. And so, actually, as an example, when I published this book, I gave a talk at Princeton University. It was a public outreach talk, and there were Peter and Rosemary Grant, who are known for studying Darwin's finches and their beaks and things like this. So they know evolution backwards and forward. And there's this guy who believes that aliens are real and have been visiting us all the time. And I got questions from both ends of that spectrum. So it was, whoa, that is a broad audience. The thing I love about convention audiences, though, is they're there because they're really eager to see the content. Right? In classes, I mean, people sign up for classes and they're interested in it, but often it's oh, this is a prerequisite for this other thing or something like that, and maybe they don't want to see every single lecture. But a convention talk, I mean, you're not going to walk in that room unless you want to see that talk that day at that time. So the level of engagement and the level of energy for what you're going over is really exhilarating. I'm sure you feel that too, Dr. Macdonald, right?
Yeah, and I think it's so funny you mentioned that, because I definitely have found something similar, that the stress of giving talks in front of professional colleagues, I actually started stressing out more giving talks in front of like Star Trek fans about Star Trek content, because you don't know how much people know. And and I always, and you and I both now, when we've given talks together, have prefaced our talks being like, we don't have every episode memorized. There's
That's
no
exactly
way to
right.
memorize everything. We might say something wrong, but
Absolutely. I was terrified of that the very first time I gave that evolution talk at Star Trek. So what I did, which thank goodness I did this, I actually videotaped myself doing it at home. I put it on YouTube and shared it to the DragonCon Trek Track Facebook group. And people called me out on stuff on the Trek pieces, which was wonderful, because then before I actually went and gave it in person, I could actually fix those pieces.
Right. I found, though, for the most part, people are pretty forgiving. They're just happy to learn something about Star Trek. So,
and they were diplomatic. They called me out, mostly in the sense that they gave me feedback. They weren't in any way rude.
It wasn't well, actually, in episode 13 of season 2.
Not like that, thankfully.
So then going the other way, how have you incorporated popular culture into your classroom? I know you have a special class that you offer, if you want to tell people a little bit about that.
There's actually two different ways we've done it. So one was collaborative with Professor Eric Span, who I mentioned before. We multiple years have taught this spring break class called the Biology Behind Popular Science Fiction TV and Movies. And since he's spoken at conventions, I've spoken at conventions. We've given some of our convention talks at that to a small group of students. But it's also really nice because we let them basically engage on whatever their favorite fandom is. I mean, some of them are coming in saying, "Oh, I'm really Doctor Who," or "I'm really into Lord of the Rings," or whatever. And we can engage on that, and just a way of engaging them on broader science. So more recently, though, after I published this book, so actually I should mention, this book is basically my introduction to genetics and evolution class, the same one that's taught in Coursera, and the same introductory class that all biology majors at Duke take. It's basically that same content, slightly lower level, but in the same order. So I thought, well, this would be a perfect non-majors class, because this is sort of a soft entry to the bio major. They can take this. It's a little bit lighter level, and there's a medium with which they can engage. So I taught that as a class, and the class was just called Genetics, Evolution, Star Trek. And it's going to appear like that on their transcripts, which I got to love that. But the response was great. I was very nervous going in, because thinking, the average audience for Star Trek is on the older side. I mean, mostly because there was that long gap from 2005 to 2017 where there was no Star Trek on TV. There was just a couple of the Kelvin Universe movies. But, that doesn't build like a giant fandom like the older generations had. And sure enough, about half the class had never seen any Star Trek before coming in the door, which I was shocked. Like, oh my gosh, what, are they going to hate this? But they loved it. They loved the idea of just having this narrative, a story associated with all the different concepts they were going to teach. And the best part is my laziness paid off at the end, where I had to go with a final project for this class. And we'd gone through the entire book, and basically they'd gotten all the content. And I had no idea what to make them do. I was like, this was a brand new class. So I just said, you know what? Why don't each of you just write me a proposal of what you want to do something on? And, I said it has to involve the science. Ideally, it involves some of the Star Trek too, but that's not an absolute requirement because, I mean, our job is to teach the science, not the Star Trek.
Right.
And
yeah.
and the creativity of what they did was fantastic. So some of them like filmed a scientifically accurate scene for a Star Trek episode, and they were really good. They had like amusing bits in it. They had like these fight scenes with sound effects and stuff like that too, but they'd be discussing some problem in it. Really cool. Some people did like a rap.
Nice.
But yeah,
That's
I
awesome.
love the students' creativity. It was just really, again, energizing.
Yeah, that's
No
really
pun
cool.
intended.
Do you, yeah. So speaking of the students who might not have, have seen any Star Trek, particularly when you're using this to teach it, did you find any difficulties of trying to like explain why you were teaching Star Trek or getting them maybe on board? Did you make any new Star Trek fans out of this
Yes, actually,
process?
great question. So I'll answer the last question first. So I asked them ahead of time if they watched any Star Trek. And I asked them at the end. So I did a pre and post survey in terms of educational techniques, and I asked them, are you equally likely, more likely, or less likely to watch more Star Trek after having taken this class? And all but like 2 or 3 said more, and I think the ones who didn't said equally.
Nice, nice.
So that was
no
great.
one was like, "You've ruined Star Trek for me."
Nobody said that, thankfully. But we actually, this is the part that some people are a little bit shaky about. We actually would watch either whole episodes or parts of episodes in class because, I mean, to put the context in there. And it was interesting. Like they were like completely drawn in. I remember there were a couple of times where I started it a little bit late. So it was going after the end of class. And I tell them like, you've seen the most essential parts. If you want to get up and leave right now, it's okay. Nobody would move. They're like, no, I want to see how this finishes off.
That's awesome. Do you find yourself, I guess, when you're talking to colleagues or anything at the university, trying to explain why you're using Star Trek for this? Yeah.
There's definitely varied opinions. Like on the most positive side, there are some people who are like, "That's so cool! I love that. I want to do something like that too." And other people are like, "Seriously."
Well, in a broader sense too, I know you've got a great analogy if you want to share about like how the general public is exposed to science and
Yeah.
the ability to use this pop culture as an anchor point.
Exactly it. I mean, if you take like say the best. So I'll give you a specific example. One of my colleagues asked me. This is actually even written in the book too. I think in the preface. One of my colleagues asked me, "Why are you doing this? Why aren't you just writing a popular science book with just the science? Like, why are you adding in all this Star Trek pieces in there too?" And well, first of all, there's a ton of popular science books out there. I mean, it's not like those don't exist. There's plenty of them. But if you look at the number of people who read those books, you could ask, and in theory, if we were in a live audience, I could ask everybody here right now, raise your hand if you've read, and I'd pick, say, one of Carl Zimmer, for example, has a really, really nice book called She Has Her Mother's Laugh. Excellent book. I highly recommend it, by the way. This is a book fair, so it's a good thing to recommend. But if you ask in an audience, a handful of hands go up, and people are very positive who've read it. And then you say, how many of you watched Avengers Endgame? And like every hand in the audience pretty much goes, or pretty close to it. Maybe 75% of the hands in the audience go up. That's the thing. I mean, people are already engaged in a particular fandom because, I mean, that's what pop culture is. It's called pop culture. The pop means popular. So if we could leverage people's interest in pop culture to get them to learn science, it's win-win.
Yeah. Yeah. So getting a little bit then, as you kind of preface getting it, literally prefaced as the preface of the book, but getting into this a little bit, do you want to tell us just kind of how this book came about and what your process was of writing it? I know it's kind of anchored in that introductory course, but yeah, I'd love to hear that.
The formatting was, yeah. So, the question came from Princeton University Press. They just wrote me and said, "Hey, we're interested in you writing a popular science book and giving a public talk associated with it." And in terms of my research area, I mean, I'm an evolutionary biologist. Probably the biggest challenge is getting people to understand why evolution is true. There is a book called, quote, "Why Evolution is True" that was written by my PhD advisor. I mean, I'm not going to improve upon that. That book's fairly recent too. It's just, just over 10 years old. It's fine. I mean, my specific sub area is speciation, the species formation. Again, he's written a book on that. So, talking with the publisher, she said, "Are there any other public talks you've given?" I was like, well, there is something. It's a little out there. But I got her to watch that draft video I mentioned, and she's like, "I like this." So kudos to them for taking the chance. In terms of the process of doing it, the outline of the book basically was, as I mentioned, my genetics and evolution class, with the exception of the very first chapter, which is more exobiology, which I didn't know anything about. I had to actually read up on that a lot and learn it myself before writing it in the book, which was a little bit stressful.
No kidding.
In terms of so actually I was very comfortable with, except for the first chapter, I was very comfortable with the science. I was very nervous that this is at least what the comment you made earlier, Dr. McDonald. I was very uncomfortable with the fact I could miss something from Star Trek. And easy thing you could say is, well, you can download the scripts, which I did, and search for terms. The problem is they don't always use the right term. Like the concept might be present, but it's not necessarily the term. So I had to go through every episode and every movie in some way. So pretty much for a year, I watched an episode a night and would go through scripts of one or two more episodes. Mostly because I couldn't do. You can go through a script in 15 minutes, but watching it takes 45. So it was a big commitment doing that. I had this giant spreadsheet with all the rows for every episode. There's over 700, by the way, for reference,
Yeah.
just to give you a scale of this. And the columns were the book chapters, and I basically just put entries in as I'm watching this episode. I'd be like, oh, that's something that's relevant for genetics. Oh, that's something that's relevant for species formation. Just make little notes as we're going. A lot of them didn't have anything that was relevant, but that's okay. It was still fun to go through. But at that point, by the end, I felt like, okay, I've gone through the series.
I think it's a testament to Star Trek that you're still a fan after that, to be perfectly honest.
I did take a little break for like a couple of weeks after that. So I think I'm good on Star Trek for a little while. I'm not gonna watch it because I often watch it for fun, but like I needed a little break there.
While you were doing this, was there any particular like revelations you had, maybe about how they use genetics or how they use DNA in Star Trek over the years? I mean, Star Trek's been around for 50 years. So.
No, that's true. And actually, that's a very good point in terms of the time frame there, that looking from, say, the older series to the more recent series, the number of mentions of DNA or genetics or genetic testing went dramatically up. So the original series was 1960s. We'd never sequenced any DNA at that point. There was a couple of quick references to genetics or nucleotides, but it's just very much in passing. And things that one would do a genetic test for now, they didn't do. And I'm not dissing the writers, because I mean, obviously they didn't know what they didn't know. It's fair. But for example, there's an episode of the original series where they're trying to see if this person, I think his name was Anton Caridian, if he was actually this Governor Kodos who had killed a lot of people. So what they did is they did this voice print analysis of him.
Oh yeah.
It's like, okay, that's a very weird way of doing it. But from the 1960s, they hadn't thought about DNA testing. It's fair. You go to the 1990s, you have Next Generation, not Discovery, Deep Space Nine and Voyager for the Star Trek series. Lots of genetics mentioned, especially Voyager, because Voyager is now in the genome era. The sequencing of the human genome is in full swing. And you see lots and lots and lots of genetics terms and things like that being tossed out. Enterprise, even more so. Enterprise was from about 2001 to 2005. I think a quarter of the episodes had mention of genetics. And then you go to the current series like Discovery and Picard and things like that. They even mention these super insider things like horizontal gene transfer and stuff like that. Whoa. They're like, clearly the writers read, like, not necessarily the scientific literature per se, but at least read like press releases about science.
Yeah, speaking, actually, we're going to mention that later, but this is a great opportunity to kind of tell that story about the horizontal gene transfer. So I'll give the context briefly and then let you jump into that. In Star Trek Discovery, which is a recent series that started in 2017, part of their plot was that they find basically a space tardigrade, and tardigrades on Earth are very tiny. Some people may have heard the term water bears or things that they're
exactly
cute, cuddly, microscopic type objects.
They're cool little feet.
They do. They do look adorable. They're adorable. But that there was a reference in the series to the fact that this tardigrade that they have uses horizontal gene transfer. So with that, I'll hand that over to you to explain maybe where they got that from and maybe some mistakes that were made along the way.
Yeah, it's one of those places where you're like, that was a heroic effort. So
good try.
Yeah, right, exactly. So tardigrades are cool in the sense that they supposedly can survive the vacuum of space. People say that all the time. Actually, if you go back to the original papers, which I did going through the book, like they can in the sense that like not all of them die, but like 96% of them die in a few hours. So it's still like they don't really, it's not like they're just fine out there in space. They're pretty messed up. But anyway, the horizontal gene transfer aspect was interesting. So around 2015, a publication came out from my neighboring university here, UNC Chapel Hill. The first author, as Dr. McDonald likes to point out, the first author's name was Boothby, who was also the name of a character in Star Trek too.
I love that.
But with that first genome sequence, they said that something like 16% of the genome of the tardigrade, so the genome's all the genetic material, 16% of it had come by horizontal gene transfer, in the sense that it was at some point in time not not ancient past, but sometime fairly recently, they had acquired genes from, say, bacteria or things like that into the genome, and then that was then passed on to subsequent tardigrades. That's a shockingly high fraction. There's lots of press releases about it, and people are speculating maybe that's how they're able to survive in space. Things like that.
Right.
So it sounds great, and I'm sure the writers saw that, and that must have been where that quote came from in that episode. The next year, a lot of people studied a little bit more carefully, and apparently the study wasn't done exactly right. Like they tried, but they were unable to eliminate all the contamination, because if you get a genome sequence from a tardigrade, you're putting the tardigrade as well as all the bacteria and stuff that are on it into the tube.
Right.
They hadn't purified out everything else that was in there and eliminated those sequences. So it definitely does not have 16% of its sequence from horizontal gene transfer. It's a trivial amount. But whenever you have, science that then, either retracts or disproves an earlier thing, it doesn't get the same publicity, it doesn't get the same press releases. So understandably, the writers didn't see that. So they just went with that original press thing, which sounded really cool. And kudos, they tried to work good science in there.
And it works in the story, that's you take it and run for it, and
exactly
go for it. So let's dig into maybe some science questions, and just to kind of put out there in case people are watching this on the stream, feel free to type some questions in as well, and we'll get to those as we go through. So the first one is kind of, I was wondering if you could go into maybe what life on other worlds would look like. We talk about science fiction. Star Trek is, going in 5-year mission to explore strange new worlds.
Yep.
What could life on other worlds look like? What would we expect to find?
It's a great question. I mean, the most likely thing, which is, it's kind of funny that Star Trek never seems to look at this, but maybe they've already found it so much by the year 2260 or whatever the year is supposed to be there that they've kind of ignored. The most likely thing would be microscopic. I mean, it wouldn't be like we're going to run into somebody who looks like us. No, it's going to be something that's microscopic, something that's vaguely like a bacterium. Because if you think about it, like here on our planet, for the first several million years of life, it was all microscopic. It was all like single-celled kind of organisms, just a membrane around stuff that then reproduces. There's something very, very, I say simple, and I don't mean to diminish it. I mean, some bacteria are actually fairly complex in some ways, but they're not.
It's okay. I don't think it's going to be offended. It's okay.
Probably not. That's a very likely thing. But it's tricky to think that when you're looking at life on other worlds, it may be so different it's hard to recognize. So one example I always like to use is that you could go someplace and look around and try to look for those sort of standard life categories, like, is it showing metabolism? Is it showing reproduction? But maybe it's doing it on a dramatically different time scale. Maybe it's doing it rather than on the order of like hours or days. Maybe it's doing on the order of like millennia.
Right.
I mean, you wouldn't see it. You go there and you're like, oh, nothing's happening. It's a bunch of dead or non-living stuff. Dead implies it was once living. And a bunch of non-living stuff. So it may be very hard to recognize. The other thing, too, is that we assume that a lot of life on other worlds will be water-based, carbon-based, things like that, like we are. And again, those things make a lot of sense here on Earth, given the temperature, given the pressure, things like that. But let's say, for example, you're in a much colder world. I mean, water is a great solvent for life. Part of the reason it's good is it's got 2 of the 3 most common elements in the universe. Hydrogen is the most common, and oxygen is the 3rd most common. So, and it's polar and things like that. But if you're in a place where the temperature never gets above, say, minus 100 Celsius, it doesn't really make sense, right? Because I mean, you're not then, it's not in liquid state. Where something like liquid ammonia might work really well. Again, hydrogen's very common. Nitrogen's pretty darn common. Maybe it wouldn't be water-based. The same with, I mean, carbon's a little trickier in the sense carbon's actually pretty good. And Star Trek is kudos to them for considering this idea of silicon-based life form. So carbon's good because it's in that column in the periodic table where it can bind to 4 other elements. Silicon is just one below it, so it can also bind to 4 other elements. However, carbon is smaller, and it allows you, and it's much easier at making long chains. Like you can have carbon, 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 carbon. Silicon doesn't do that nearly as well. Like you can get long chain silicon, but it'll often break down and then try to just basically become silicon dioxide or sand in the presence of oxygen. Not good for life.
But I think it's a lot of that. It's those unknown unknowns. We don't know what to look for. We only have our reference point here on Earth. But yeah, I mean, Star Trek had the silicon-based life forms back in the 60s, right? Was the Horta
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep, exactly. And then they repeated it again later on with in the Next Generation with the what's it called? The episode was called Silicon Avatar, but it was the crystalline entity.
Yeah, I was just about the crystalline entity. We also had those. And we've also had giant, space whales and energy beings, and they've got a little
Yeah.
creative with that.
That's the one nice thing about Star Trek is in general, it doesn't usually fall back on magic. So in terms of in terms of
Yeah.
non-corporeal things, every now and then it does that. But
Well, a lot of what it does do is use bipedal humanoids. And
yes,
so there are a few attempts in Star Trek to explain why we find bipedal humanoids
there are.
everywhere,
Yeah.
particularly the chase. Was
Yeah.
it
Again,
solved?
another heroic effort.
Okay, so for those people who might not be aware, I'll try to recap the chase as much as I can and then hand it over to you. But essentially, they find this being that lets the Klingons, the Romulans, Vulcans, and humans, and all of these species know that there was a single point that they had all evolved from, that this one species had basically seeded the galaxy, and all of these different species had come from them. So how is that as an explanation? Does that work for you?
Again, heroic effort. So the idea that life on Earth started elsewhere, say the original single-celled life on Earth came from outer space in some way, that's a concept called panspermia. It's possible. I mean, I wouldn't say there's proof of it, but there's no proof against it. There's some elements which suggest it could be true. I mean, we've seen, things like amino acid components or nucleotide components in meteorites. So it's possible something was introduced to Earth from wherever that then seeded life on the planet. Either just provided a chemical in some fashion that wasn't available, or it wasn't as readily available, or it was actually like a microbe. That's possible. Now, the tricky thing with that, and the timing in that episode is really good because they suggested that was 4 billion years old, which, I mean, that's exactly the right timing for Earth. So, again, they clearly did their research on this when they had the concept, they had the timing. The problem was this idea of 4 billion years of independent evolution leading to exactly the same place at the end. Even though people often say, what if the environments are the same? Even if the environments are absolutely the same for that entire period, that is a very, very, very long time for random chance events not to have had a major, major impact. So the example I love to give on this particular one is the asteroid that knocked back the dinosaurs 65 million years ago. Did that happen on all those other worlds 65 million years ago? There's a lot of other examples like that too, like the original swallowing of a microbe that made the first mitochondrion that we have. I mean, those are such random events. To think that those all happen and you have exactly the same outcome at the very end. It's
Yeah, I think
infinitesimal.
the analogy I've heard you give that I really like is where we would have more in common with a blade of grass than we
That's
would with a
correct.
Klingon.
Exactly. You would be genetically more related to grass than a Klingon. Absolutely right.
It's so interesting.
There is a
So
better one though. If you go back to the original series, that they suggested that they found this like Native American tribe that was a little weird. They found this Native American tribe on this random planet, but the idea that maybe so if you have something like say a Klingon or whatever, if it was people taken from Earth say 100,000 years ago, and maybe not actually human, maybe some sort of proto-human, some pre-Neanderthal human thing, and plopped onto some other world, and given enough stuff to live, would they've changed a little? Maybe they've got little ripples on their foreheads. It's possible.
so what's a time scale that wouldn't make you
Probably around
sick to
that.
your stomach? Around
Well, the tricky
100,000 years ish?
Yeah, well, the tricky thing is, yeah, exactly, because they have to be interfertile. At least as the episodes seem to suggest that you can have offspring with Klingons and potentially fertile offspring with Klingons, as we've seen. So yeah, 100,000 years, yeah, that's doable.
Okay.
I mean, we interbred with Neanderthal, and a little bit more recently than that, and obviously just about all people, unless you have straight African ancestry, just about all people have some Neanderthal ancestry, so that works.
Nice. So one question you and I both always get asked about this episode. It's a classic Star Trek Voyager episode where they go warp 10, which for my relevancy is the theoretical limit of warp drive, where you're bending all of space and time around your ship. But in the episode itself, once they go to warp 10, they then start to evolve into amphibians. Would you like to tell us your thoughts on that episode?
This one's harder to say. This was a heroic effort. I was a little off the rails. It was actually a really fun episode. I'll give them that. But I'm glad.
Not terrible.
Oh, exactly. So I think you and I are both very grateful that we were not contracted a science consultant for that, where they gave us this plot and said, "Here, make this work." That would have been horrifying.
I think the big issue is like there's and maybe a couple things you could touch on is it happens very fast and in seemingly random order. So Tom Paris is the one that this sort of initially happens to, the character. Various things happen to him. So that's one thing, is how quickly it all happens. But then the other thing is what they turn into. And so if you want to touch on this.
So much about it was very strange, because I remember in the very beginning he became allergic to water. It's like, most of your body is water. And then he like died and then came back to life. And it's like, wait, what? How did that happen? I don't understand. Like, were his cells still getting oxygen while he was dead somehow? I don't know. And then he came back and he had like a second heart. I mean, and this goes back to your speed comment too. Like, heart cells divide like really slowly. So I mean, if you have like rapid growth or rapid cell division, that's what we call cancer. That's not a good thing. It's not going to make you a second heart. It's going to make you like have this weird thing that messes everything. The worst part about it is the directionality. So they kind of answered this. They kept on saying that somehow he's going to some future human state, which is a little bit weird, but you know, we can't disprove it. Somehow we're going to evolve into becoming amphibian. I mean, some mammals did go back to the water. I mean, we see whales. I mean, they started on land and went back to the water, so fair. But the directionality to it is very troubling. And then the fact that it's so perfect, like this organism just basically goes from human to this complete other form and is interfertile with another individual who's just in that other form. It's not random mutations that are happening. It's very, very directional. You know, if it was something, let's say that this was some product of genetic engineering, you know, even then it's a stretch, but at least it's better.
Right. So speaking of the sort of directionality with the evolution here, there's another famous episode in The Next Generation called Genesis.
Yeah, it's the other direction.
Where the crew seemingly de-evolves fairly randomly. We get one of our characters, Lieutenant Barkley, de-evolves into a spider. So what are your thoughts on that episode?
Well, let me say the good thing about it. The good part about it, well, a couple of good parts. First, they acknowledge common ancestry of species on Earth. I mean, the fact that they're acknowledging that, you know, humans and spiders are related, and was it Spot became an iguana? Spot the cat became an iguana. A little odd there. The how was more problematic. So the way they explained it was that introns in the genes, I'll explain what those are in just a second. Introns in the genes were activated, and Data defined introns in this episode. Data is a character in Star Trek, if you're not familiar. I know you're familiar, Dr. Macdonald. The way they defined introns was that they're evolutionary holdovers, genes that had a function in the past and no longer do. That's not what an intron is. That's called a pseudogene. That's a completely different thing. Introns are just these spacer things that are found within genes that have no present function, but maybe never had a function. I mean, they're just there. They get cut out in the process of making protein products. Well, first of all, that would never happen. Like even if you were to do this with pseudogenes and you turn them on. So we have, for example, in our bodies, we have vitamin C pseudogenes because we can't produce our own vitamin C. But for example, dogs can produce their own vitamin C. That's why they don't need to have vitamin C supplements, whereas we do. If you were to somehow just activate our vitamin C gene, it's not going to work because it's been broken for so long. It's accumulated mutations that you can't just get the past state. And that's the big issue, that like it's not like there's this blueprint of all our evolutionary history just sitting there intact over time. It's gotten just broken up over time with many mutations. But then the other issue is Barkley in particular. So Riker, who's the first officer in the show, he de-evolved into some proto-humanoid. Not great, but not from At least we have proto-humanoid ancestors. We have no spider ancestors. We share ancestors with spiders, but none of our ancestors were spiders. It's kind of like you didn't descend from your cousin, but you share ancestors with your cousin.
Right. So it's like having to go up the chain and then back down again somewhere else. Yeah.
Exactly.
Gotcha. So more generally, how does Star Trek do when talking about evolution? I mean, we kind of pulled out some specific examples to kind of poke at, but
those are definitely dramatic examples.
Yeah.
Usually they're pretty good. I mean, especially on genetics, and if you go recently, if you're talking about basic, I'll come back to evolution in a second. Mm-hmm. On basic genetics terms, like what is dominant, things like that, they've got it down. Like, how is DNA used for genetic testing? I mean, especially post original series, they've got that down, and they're quite good at it. And the representations they use are often like dead on. Like, yep, that's what would happen. I mean, maybe the speed of it's dramatically faster, but it's the future. I mean, people right now, if you go back 20 years ago and show people what we do today, they might think that's science fiction. So that's pretty good. As you start getting to anything with mutations, it's just about all sci-fi. Whenever they go into mutations, it always kind of goes off the rails. This is true with X-Men. This is true with anything else. One of the big problems with mutations in general is that people tend to assume that it happens all over the body at once, so everything is still compatible. Which, I mean, if you have mutations, it's just going to make these random changes in different cells. And again, you're way more likely to get cancer or die than you are to like grow another arm or something like that. In evolution, they're very good at acknowledging common ancestry, and that comes up in many, many episodes. Like in the finale for the Next Generation, they went back in time and saw that first formation of life on Earth, and the timing of it was right too. So I mean, they're very good about that. As they get into like things like de-evolving or future forms of evolution, then there's often this assumption of we know where things are going, or the past looks just like something that's present day today. Again, and then I'm criticizing Star Trek on this in a sense, but all science fiction does, because this is a common public misconception. And that's the nice thing about giving these sorts of talks, because we can try to address these. The places where Star Trek gets it wrong are places where everybody gets it wrong who's not like working in this field, and it's a great chance to try to correct those things and use them as teaching moments.
Right. Our favorite teaching moments. This is wrong and this is why it's wrong. Yeah.
Exactly.
So we'll be getting to kind of the public questions in a little bit, so if people have them, feel free to send them in. What are some of your just personal favorite episodes or examples that you either used in your book or you really like to pull out? I mean, I kind of referenced a few well-known ones that the public generally thinks of, but are there any that you are particularly fond of?
There's an episode that I often use in our spring break class from Voyager called Favorite Son. And it's not that it's like a great episode. It's a little bit of a cheesy episode. But they use a lot of genetics terms in there, and again, they show some misconceptions, but overall, it's actually not bad. So let me give you just some of the context on that episode. It's Harry Kim, one of the members of the crew, suddenly starts showing these weird symptoms where he seems to be somehow transitioning to becoming another species or something like that. It's not exactly clear what's happening at first. They go to this planet, and what they say is, "Oh, you actually." Are actually our species, and when you get closer to our planet, you start exhibiting these signs of having come from this other world. But the way they explain it, they say, "Oh, you're." One of the misconceptions actually is they say your Teresian genes, so that's the planet they were from, became dominant, which means that now they're expressing more. It's true, like in the sense if they were becoming dominant, they would then be expressing more, and you would then start over time to look more and more like a Teresian. That part's good. One of the problems with it, though, is they said that they couldn't see that beforehand looking at his DNA sequence. That's not correct, because if you're looking at the DNA sequence, it doesn't matter if it's dominant or recessive. The DNA is there. It has the DNA letters AATGC, or whatever. You would see it whether it's recessive or dominant or anything like that. But again, it's a good teaching moment. There were comments later about how what actually happened is he had potentially gotten infected with something like a retrovirus. Again, retroviruses do insert DNA into our cells. That could happen. There are a lot of genetic bases to behaviors, and again, this was something that was represented in the show. Overall, I felt like it wasn't so much that it was a great episode for the biology or anything like that, but there was just a lot of teaching moments in there, so I like using that one.
That's good. So the last question I personally have for you is, you and I are both now science consultants for Star Trek. For you, what has that journey been like, going from a pure fan of Star Trek, then starting to incorporate Star Trek into your work, and now starting to incorporate your work into Star Trek?
Yeah, I can't begin to express how privileged I feel to have the opportunity to do this. Back when I was in college, around, I think it was summer 1990, I remember talking with my department, Professor Wiseman. I remember him asking me, like, what would you love to do in the future? What would you really like to do? And at the time I said, I would love to do science consultations for Star Trek. It was that specific. Here we are 30 years later, and like, oh my gosh, I actually have the opportunity to, have some creative input into, with their permission, of course, into like where these things are going. And that it is such a privilege. I'm so honored. And, I do it like a small fraction of the time you get to do it, Dr. Macdonald. So, kudos to you and thank you for making the science better for everybody.
Oh, like we froze you for a second there.
Oh, no.
Yep, you're good. You're back.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, no, of course. And thank you. I appreciate that. You also have done public events for Star Trek. So do you want to talk about maybe
Sure.
the various Star Trek events that you've done? Not just Dragon Con, a general
Yeah.
pop culture convention, but Star Trek conventions themselves.
Yeah, no, I mean the most extreme I think for me in terms of just an immersive experience was the Star Trek cruise, which you and I did together this last time. I know you did it even before that as well too, but wow, the level of engagement of everybody in the science was phenomenal. And this wasn't something like, it's not like anybody signed up for this cruise saying, I want to go to this cruise to learn science. I don't think anybody went with any intention of that's what I want to actually do on this cruise. But I'll give a couple of examples. So I started having these sort of breakfast office hours, as I called them. It's basically it's just a chance to talk to people more than just at the Q&A sessions or people stopping me as I'm walking by on the ship. Thought it would be fun to do that. So I said, well, breakfast time's a good time because it's before everybody's off on their excursions and things like that. So I just, there was a buffet restaurant. It's kind of strange to think of buffet restaurants now, given what the world is like now. But I was in the buffet with some breakfast, but it would be at 8:30 in the morning. Okay, 8:30. That's pretty early, and this is on a cruise ship, so people are partying till really late at night. I would show up at 8, so a half hour beforehand to grab some food, and there would already be like a line of people waiting there to talk science. That level of enthusiasm was amazing, and they were so excited to talk about science. And sometimes they had specific things they wanted to bring up, and they say, "Hey, have you heard about this?" And sometimes it was Star Trek related. Sometimes it was completely not. Sometimes it's like, "Hey, I just had a genetic test, and it showed me this, and that was really cool. What do you think?" All over the place. So it was fascinating, and just the group sitting there chatting about it, the energy around it was phenomenal. But just the level of respect that we got. I mean, you and I were on there as we're not the actors. I mean, I'm not William Shatner.
We're the B-list, Mohamed.
Yeah, right, exactly. But I remember by the last couple of days, as I was walking down the hall, I did an experiment. I would just tell everybody hi as I walked by them, and I'd say hi and wave. Three quarters would answer back, "Hi, Professor."
Wow.
It's not like I was wearing a hat that said Professor.
They knew who you were, and they appreciated it. Yeah,
that's amazing. You probably had similar experiences, I'm assuming.
Yeah, I mean, and for us, a lot of what we were doing was kind of early in the morning, and we would kind of have the early block, and yeah, we would have full packed crowds for a science talk, and it was sometimes we were giving just pure science talks. I think I did Astronomy 101 in Star Trek.
That's right. That was a stellar talk too, by the way. Thank you. But I mean, that comes back to the very, very first thing you asked about the start of this interview, in the sense that, why use these things? This is an audience that is predisposed to wanting to learn more about science because they like a specific kind of genre of sci-fi that tries to give explanations. So they're much more likely to be engaged in this topic, and they're much more open to wanting to learn more. So that's one of the, kudos to the Star Trek fan community.
Yeah, for sure. Definitely agree. All right, so we have a few questions that have come in. First up is from Aaron Loss, who wants to know, has anyone done any studies on the use of technology that we have today and possible future bioengineering as we start to build more implants or, reliance on technology that could impact our evolution as a species, possibly on the time scale for Star Trek? So between now and 100, 200, 300 years in the future, how would the technology that we incorporate in our lives affect our evolution?
That's a great question. So I guess one thing that would happen, this is a great question. It's also a little bit of a loaded question, but kudos for asking it. The biggest thing that happens now in general is that probably people who say like 200 years ago would not have survived, myself included. I mean, I was born almost 3 months premature. People who would have been born, who would not have survived, now are able to survive. So there's a lot more genetic diversity that is allowed to persist in natural populations of humans than would have been before. Now, genetic diversity is the stuff of evolution. So basically, the opportunities for change are much greater than would have otherwise been if we didn't have that. So that, that is actually, I mean, it sounds, I mean, people who are eugenicists say like, oh, this is a bad thing. I actually would argue the exact opposite. That's why I was saying it's loaded, because it sounds a little bit like the eugenics piece. But I would say the opposite. Our ability to adapt to a changing environment is dramatically higher now than it would have been if we didn't have a lot of these technological advances that allow us to maintain much larger amounts of genetic variation that may help us to adapt to, for example, global climate change. That may help us adapt to, other sorts of changing conditions in our environment. Maybe adapt to going to another planet in the future. Who knows? So,
Interesting. That's great. How does and how did Star Trek influence science in their work today? And yeah, is there, kind of conversely, but is there elements of Star Trek science that has now become a reality?
Oh yeah, well, mostly more in engineering than in straight up science for sure. So I mean, there's a lot of things. Like if you go back to, say, for example, the flip phones from, say, the early 2000s. I remember when I had one, the very first time I got one, you pop it open, you go, Kirk Enterprise. People would do that all the time. Eventually it became normal enough nobody did that anymore. But, clearly, and I think I even read someplace that design was actually inspired by the communicators from the original Star Trek. iPads, there basically are these things called pads that are basically iPads, and all through the Star Trek Next Generation. Google Glass looks just like something Commander Sisko used to wear all the time in Deep Space Nine. There's so many things that what happens is it shows people a possibility, and people are like, I want to do that, I want to make that. And you're more likely to see that with, say, engineering than with straight up science, because I mean, engineering means you get to make it. I mean, I don't get to change science. Now, I know, for example, I think you might be able to answer this better than me. I think people are inspired to go into, say, astrophysics. They're like, I want to learn how to make warp drive.
Yeah. Well, and I think in general, a lot of people who have gone in, I mean, we now have almost multiple generations now who have been exposed to Star Trek. And so people have gone into engineering or science because of Star Trek, and then have an opportunity to design like a Kindle and would be like, it looks suspiciously like exactly what they used on Next Generation.
Exactly.
Yeah, that inspiration we definitely just insert at any chance we get.
Exactly. And there was that X Prize competition recently for making a tricorder, for a medical tricorder.
Yeah. And it got awarded. It was, I think that was a Qualcomm X Prize. They set out these parameters to say, we want a tricorder, and it's got to be able to, at a base level, read 8 biosigns and
exactly. They had a bunch of criteria. You had to do a minimum number of them. I forget what it was. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. We'll get there. We just want to work at Starfleet. That's all we want.
That's right. Exactly.
So Nick G,
the exobiology division.
right. Nick G asks, there was an episode, and I think I know which one this is referring to, where Geordi and his old crewmates returned to a planet and evolved into something.
Oh yeah, where they became like kind of invisible or something like that.
Yeah, how would that work?
No.
So I think that one is the Identity Crisis. That's the one that's like the nightmare fuel, veiny Geordi LaForge one. Yeah.
Now, again, you can get infected with something that will change your behavior. So that aspect can happen. As you start getting into genetic changes, again, genetic changes are really hard to do on an adult human because we have so many cells. So you'd have to have it so like it affects like all your cells or enough of your cells that everything still works together, right? That's really hard to do. So if you get rid of the genetic part of it, get rid of it becoming another species, but essentially make it more something just sort of taking you over and making you do other stuff. It's still a little bit out there, but maybe some weird virus infection, that affects like your behavior in a very directional way that helps the transmission of the virus. Maybe. I mean, there's that fungus that takes over ants and makes them do specific behaviors.
Oh yeah, I forgot about that thing. That's horrible.
That's creepy.
I mean, and I think too, it's not just viruses that we've seen, but we've also seen Star Trek use parasites quite a bit to be controlling. Can you? Are there any examples of those you can think of that they use?
I know there are examples of them. The one that jumps to mind, though, I don't think it's a good example. Is where in Enterprise, where Trip Tucker basically gets. It's not. I don't think it wasn't exactly a parasite, but he got impregnated, where he grew this weird nipple on his hand, but it was just because he touched this person from another species. We never actually saw what the offspring would have looked like there, but that was an
intense episode.
That was an intense episode. It was a little strange.
Awesome.
Also,
That's
not sure
so
why he'd have a nipple on his hand. Like,
right. Yeah, that was a whole lot of weird because doesn't that also it was like stuck his hand in the marbles. It was
exactly.
how
That
they
was exactly
mated.
what it
Yeah,
was. That was
yeah,
exactly
yeah.
what it was. A whole lot.
That's so funny. So can you or have you applied the same approach that you've used with Star Trek
Yeah,
to talking about science in other fandoms? I know you
absolutely.
briefly mentioned your spring break class, but
Absolutely, absolutely. So you certainly can. I mean, the advantage of Star Trek is there's so much content, and almost all of it has some level of explanation, right? I mean, there's not many other fandoms that have 700 plus episodes that are explaining things that are observed. So I mean, people often say, "Well, why not Star Wars?" I'm like, Star Wars. I mean, the number of hours of Star Trek versus Star Wars, Star Trek has like 100 times more. So finding something to, I mean, you can find like individual examples from any fandom that you could work with. But what you want, if you want to have it from a single fandom, you need a lot of material. So Star Trek is unusually good in that regard. But yeah, I mean, I've done it. I mean, Dr. Span and I gave a talk at DragonCon, I forget, it was 2 or 3 years ago, on the genetics of inbreeding using Game of Thrones. Why not?
right.
There's a lot of inbreeding that happens there.
What did you learn? Did you learn anything from that, or?
We basically just talked about how inbreeding works and stuff like that. Actually, it's funny because that actually tied really closely to a National Science Foundation grant that I was working on at the time, just to not specifically on inbreeding, but studying like detrimental mutations. So basically, what happens when you inbreed is you expose detrimental recessive mutations because everybody has bad mutations, but if you have a kid, for example, with your sister or brother, you're more likely to have the same bad mutation. So then your kid gets 2 copies, and that's why it's bad. And that works really well in terms of identifying what's happening in the Targaryen family, for example, and maybe why madness is so common there.
Interesting. In your spring break class, have you had students dig into something that you didn't expect and actually
Oh
find
yeah,
some science stuff?
they take everything. No, often what they do is they often start with the fandom and then go to the science. They'll say like, "I'm a fan of Avatar: The Last Airbender. Let's do something science." And I'm like, "You can try."
That's pretty impressive. I
Yep.
like that. So the
Danny
creative.
Phantom was another one.
Oh yeah, nice. Didn't you guys went to go see Kong when that came? Was that
We
when
did. That was
yeah.
perfect. Yeah, we went to go see Kong Skull Island. And it was funny because I think the day before or day after, we also went to the Duke Lemur Center. So the students' class final project was to contrast the biodiversity of Madagascar with Kong Skull Island and try to explain why one went one way and why it went the other way, and what works and what doesn't work.
That's amazing. All right. So we have another question from the Creative District, and we've got our last few here. The Creative District asked, do you think the original creators of Star Trek, our good friend Gene Roddenberry, imagined the show would champion science the way that it does? What do you think that they would think if they could come back now and seeing science be embraced in this manner?
It's a good question. I mean, I don't know much about Gene Roddenberry as a person himself, but I imagine he must have embraced it. I mean, the whole show, I mean, the entire spirit of it from the intro sequence is in the spirit of exploration, right? And you see that throughout the entire series. I mean, there's lots of, it's not just about, I mean, so there's research that has a very applied and obvious reason for doing it. So, for example, cancer research. Of course, we do cancer research because people die from cancer all the time. We need to stop cancer. Of course, we're going to do that. But pure, basic exploratory research doesn't get as much, press or love, frankly, because there's a lot of really important things to it. But Star Trek shows it all the time. They're like, let's go look at that. Well, what's the immediate application? I don't know. Maybe there will be an application, but we don't know right now. But that, I mean, the biggest advances don't usually come solely from applied research, but they come from some interaction between basic research and applied research. And they see that all the time. They're always wanting to go check out some new nebula or check out some new life form in Star Trek. And as an example, in the real world here, if you go back to the 1960s, there was somebody who was studying, these microbes in these hot springs. Just see what's there, what's cool about them. They found an enzyme in there. It's a polymerase, which is basically makes more DNA. They found an enzyme that works at these super high temperatures. That is the basis for just about every molecular biology application from the 1980s on. So you may have heard of PCR, the polymerase chain reaction. That polymerase they used is from Thermus aquaticus, which is what they found in the organism they found in those hot vents. Everything you see about DNA fingerprinting, all those things, those would have been pushed back a decade or more if that enzyme had not been found.
Wow, that's crazy. That's really
Right?
impressive. So we have a few questions here about the Star Trek consulting. I'm gonna try to rephrase them a little bit so
Thank you.
because we have
No
so
spoilers.
neither of us get trapped in NDA nightmares here.
Yep.
So Sue Ellen asked about providing scientific advice on how life on a certain planet might evolve. So in a broader sense, if you're asked to come up with a way that evolution would progress on any planet, how would you approach that question?
So, and so Star Trek has done some of this. So, for example, on Andoria, in the series Enterprise, there are actually like two humanoid species. There's the Andorians, which everybody knows are these blue ones, but there's also these other species called the Enars that live in this very cold area, and they're very sort of bleached white and things like that. That follows one of the what we call the ecogeographic rules on Earth, that as you go to, say, polar climates, you tend to see less colored species. I mean, you think about like polar bears versus grizzly or brown bears. I mean, you tend to see, as you go to the colder climate, you tend to see the ones that have a background more similar to snow. That's the kind of thing I would probably try to pursue if given a question like that. Not saying if I have or have not had one, but I try to follow these sort of general rules that sort of fit to the environment that would have happened from natural selection happening over generations. And Star Trek's already been pretty good about trying to do that in general. There are a few exceptions here, and I know if Dr. Spanda were here, he'd be highlighting one particular one he likes to bring up in some of his talks that was an exception to that rule.
Which is?
This is this giant bright red species that was found on this ice planet that, like, there's a whole lot of reasons that doesn't work. I will say that's from, I will say that's from the cinematic side of Star Trek, not from the TV side. So just saying.
Well, along those, so this is our last set of questions. Marina asked you.
Hi, Marina.
Yep. If again, I'm rephrasing for NDA stuff, so apologies to Marina here, but the last question from Sue Ellen you answered, talking about like if asking them what the environment is and then taking that from there. Exactly. But if you were given a question of just any generic, come up with an alien species, we need a new alien. We need you to come up with something. What would be your approach to that question?
Oh yeah. Non-humanoid for sure. Let's set aside the humanoid aspect.
Our makeup budgets are better now than they used to be. So we have CGI,
or CGI
now.
Exactly. Definitely non-humanoid. I mean, some of it's going to have to depend. I mean, obviously, like we're working with a fictional franchise where like we have to engage viewers. Like saying, I want to have this microbial thing. Like they're going to be like, no, I don't want to do that. Fair, because I mean, I don't want to watch something where everybody's looking at microscopes all the time. That'd be really boring.
What would pique our interest as scientists does not necessarily apply to the whole public. Yeah.
But definitely non-humanoid, and probably just something. I try to basically take elements that you see from some of the species today and maybe exaggerate them a lot. That's probably what I try to do.
Right. And then Marina was kind enough to ask me personally, is there anything I can tell people about my involvement with Star Trek Prodigy, given the big announcement that happened only 48 hours ago? So for people who aren't aware, there is a new there are actually 6 shows in various stages of development in the Star Trek universe. One of which is Star Trek Prodigy, which is a collaboration with Nickelodeon to make a kids animated Star Trek show. And the big announcement from 2 days ago is that it is going to be starring Kate Mulgrew back as Captain Janeway, and I myself in my virtual environment am sitting on her bridge. So I personally am a big fan of Captain Janeway, and I think she has inspired many people to go into the sciences, myself included. She got me through my PhD. I wouldn't have made it without her.
Awesome.
And that's exactly what they are intending for the show. And that's what Alex Kurtzman said, that, they want to use her inspiration, and they have this new audience, a new generation to possibly be inspired by her as well. So my involvement has been, like the other shows, helping with getting the science right in that, but also figuring out how to tailor the content and the writing to help inspire kids to be involved. And also, I mean, I'm not going to lie, my deep knowledge of Captain Janeway as a character has helped from time to time. But
And she was a science officer, right? A former science officer.
yes, she was. Yeah, her origins were as a science officer. So I have a deep connection to Janeway, and I will say personally, when they told me, which I've been sitting on for about a year, so I think I can prove I can keep a secret at this point. But yeah, it was a big moment for me. Everyone was very excited to tell me. I have a tattoo of Voyager on my arm, so it's a big deal. So anyway, not to pivot this conversation away from Professor Noor, but with that, we are pretty much wrapped up. And I will say thank you so much for your insight. If people do want to check it out, I will say I reference this book a lot. I think that it's a great breakdown for me who doesn't have a lot of biology knowledge. It's a great introduction, and if you're a Star Trek fan, you can definitely pick it up and learn some stuff from that too. Do you have any events or anything that you'd like to mention to people?
Oh yeah, the virtual TrekCon starts on October 15th, and I'll be actually helping run the vendor room there. But there's gonna be a lot of great stuff there, a lot of actors, writers, and vendors, everything. So definitely check that out next week.
And if people want to find more Star Trek biology content, they can find your YouTube channel called Trekkie Explains. If you search for that, that'll pop right up, and it's fabulous with some excellent. You can dig into the various episodes that we talked about here. You've got YouTube videos on that too. So thank you again for being here.
Thank you for being a wonderful moderator.
Thanks. So if anyone watching would like to purchase Professor Noor's book, just go to oldfirehousebooks.com/bookfest2020. Book plates are available from select authors there, so please indicate if you are interested in a signed copy. And then finally, please go to focobookfest.org and fill out our survey. I know there are a lot of people here who this might be your first time at the Fort Collins Book Festival, so we really rely on the community to guide us in planning future book festivals. And I encourage personally all of you to check out the schedule for this weekend and next weekend for more excellent free events that are going to be happening. So thank you all very much, and enjoy the rest of the festival.